The battlefield was a graveyard of fire and smoke. General Aldric stood at the edge of a shattered trench, his bloodied command baton gripped tightly in his hand. Around him, soldiers scrambled to reload weapons, administer aid, or pull the fallen from the mud. Overhead, the Zyrathians' warships loomed, their jagged, obsidian-like forms blotting out the sun as waves of energy blasts rained down. "Hold the line!" Aldric's voice cut through the chaos, ironclad and resolute. Even as his forces faltered, their commander stood as a symbol of defiance. To the men and women under his command, Aldric was more than a leader. He was their last hope. The Zyrathians were relentless, a species of cold-blooded invaders who viewed Earth not as a home to conquer but as a resource to strip bare. For years, humanity had fought them across continents, oceans, and now in the ruins of its once thriving cities. The war had taken everything from Aldric, his family, his friends, and his future. Yet, even as defeat seemed inevitable, he refused to kneel. "Artillery unit, focus fire on their flank." Aldric barked into his communicator. "Alpha Squad, secure the eastern ridge. If they take it, we're done." The orders were precise, calculated, and nearly impossible. But his soldiers obeyed without hesitation. That was the kind of loyalty Aldric inspired. Still, the enemy's numbers were overwhelming. For every Zyrathian felled, 2 more emerged from their twisted landing craft. Aldric's forces were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and running out of time. "General," a voice crackled over his communicator. It was Captain Harrow, one of his most trusted officers. "The second wave is approaching fast. We won't hold much longer." Aldric's jaw tightened. Retreat was the only option, but it was a bitter pill to swallow. He glanced around the battlefield, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what such an order would mean. The wounded would be left behind. The dead would remain unburied. "Pull back to the rally point," Aldric finally commanded. "Fall back, but keep it organized. We'll live to fight another day." His soldiers obeyed, retreating in tight, disciplined formations under the cover of what little firepower they had left. As they moved, Aldric lingered at the rear, ensuring no one was left behind. He shot down a Zyrathian scout with precision, his plasma pistol a blur of motion. By the time the survivors reached the rally point, a cluster of caves hidden in the foothills, the remnants of humanity's resistance were barely more than a tattered shadow of what they had once been. Inside the caves, soldiers slumped against walls or tended to each other's wounds in grim silence. The air was thick with despair, and Aldric felt its weight pressing on his shoulders. Yet he couldn't afford to show weakness. "General," Captain Harrow approached him, her face pale and streaked with soot. "We're running out of options. Supplies are dwindling, and the Zyrathians are tightening their grip. If we don't find a way to turn the tide—" "We will," Aldric interrupted, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "We have to." Harrow hesitated before nodding, though the doubt in her eyes lingered. "There's something else," she said, lowering her voice. "Some of the men are talking about the old legends. The dragons in the mountains." Aldric's brow furrowed. "Dragons?" Harrow nodded. "You know the stories, sir. Ancient beings who once protected humanity in its darkest hour. Some believe they're still out there, waiting for the right time to return." Aldric let out a heavy sigh. Myths and fairy tales had no place in a war like this. Yet something about the mention of dragons stirred a memory, an old story his father had told him as a boy, about a time when Earth was defended not by armies, but by creatures of fire and scale. "And you think we should chase a bedtime story?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Harrow hesitated. "I think we've tried everything else, sir. If there's even a chance." Aldric's gaze shifted to the mouth of the cave, where the dying light of the sun painted the horizon in shades of orange and red. He had led his people through every strategy, every maneuver, and still they were losing. Perhaps it was time to try something different. "Gather a small team," Aldric said at last. "We leave at dawn. If these dragons exist, we'll find them. If not," he didn't finish the thought. He didn't have to. As the soldiers settled in for the night, whispers of the dragons spread through the camp like wildfire. Some scoffed, others dared to hope. Aldric remained silent, his mind already focused on the journey ahead. He would find these mythical beings or he would die trying. For humanity, there were no other options. The legend of General Aldric and his dragon guardians had begun. The journey into the mountains was treacherous. General Aldric and his hand-picked team navigated narrow trails and jagged cliffs, the wind biting through their worn armor. The terrain was as unforgiving as the war they had left behind, but Aldric pressed forward, driven by a faint glimmer of hope, or perhaps desperation. "General, are we really doing this?" Sergeant Dorn asked, his voice strained as he climbed beside Aldric. "I mean, dragons? It sounds impossible," Aldric replied without turning. "Ridiculous," Dorn muttered, though he kept moving. The team reached a towering stone gate at the heart of the mountains by nightfall. Carved into the mountainside, the structure was ancient, its surface etched with intricate patterns of flames and wings. A strange energy pulsed in the air, making the hairs on Aldric's neck stand on end. "This is it," Captain Harrow said, stepping closer to inspect the carvings. The legend spoke of a gateway hidden in the mountains. "It has to be here." Aldric studied the gate, his fingers brushing against the cool, weathered stone. At the center of the gate was an inscription, its symbols glowing faintly in the darkness. "Can you read it?" Dorn asked. "It's not a language I've ever seen," Aldric admitted. Yet something about it felt familiar. Almost instinctively, he placed his palm on the glowing symbols. The ground trembled. The symbols flared to life, radiating golden light as the massive gate groaned and began to open. Beyond it lay a cavern, vast and luminous, its walls glistening with veins of crystalline light. The team exchanged wary glances before Aldric stepped forward, leading them inside. The cavern was unlike anything they had ever seen. Massive statues of dragons lined the walls, their eyes glowing faintly as if watching the intruders. At the center of the cavern was a platform surrounded by swirling, fiery orbs. The air was thick with power, ancient and overwhelming. "Stay alert," Aldric ordered, though his voice carried a rare note of awe. A sudden roar shattered the silence, echoing through the chamber and shaking the ground beneath their feet. The team raised their weapons, their eyes darting around the cavern. From the shadows emerged a colossal figure, a dragon, its scales shimmering like molten gold. Its eyes burned with intelligence and fury. "I am Corthan," the dragon's voice boomed, deep and resonant, vibrating through their very bones. "Who dares disturb the sanctity of this place?" Aldric stepped forward, unflinching. "We are humanity's last hope," he said, his voice steady. "Our world is under siege by invaders who will destroy everything. We've come to ask for your help." Corthan's eyes narrowed, the flames in his chest glowing brighter. "Your kind abandoned us long ago," he rumbled. "Why should we now fight for you?" "Because we fight for survival," Aldric replied. "Not for conquest, not for power. We stand together or we fall. Help us, and we will fight alongside you as allies." The dragon was silent for a long moment, its gaze piercing. Then, without warning, it unleashed a torrent of fire. But Aldric didn't flinch. He stood firm, his face set with determination. "Courage," Corthan finally said, his tone softer, though still powerful. "Perhaps humanity is not lost after all. But words mean little. Prove your worth, human. Prove you deserve our power." As the swirling orbs around the platform began to rise, Aldric felt the weight of the challenge ahead. Humanity's survival depended on what happened next. The Guardians had awakened, but trust was far from earned. The roar of the dragon Corthan split the air as he soared above the human military base, his massive wings casting shadows over the crumbling structures below. Beside him flew Cirith, sleek and agile, her emerald scales reflecting the faint light of a dying sun. Emberus, the youngest and most fiery of the trio, followed close behind, his crimson form leaving trails of heat in his wake. The soldiers on the ground watched in stunned silence, their disbelief mingling with awe. "They're real," one soldier whispered. General Aldric stood at the center of the chaos, his voice sharp and commanding as he rallied his troops. "Enough staring. Prepare for deployment." The Zyrathians won't wait for us to gawk. It had been weeks since Aldric's return from the mountains, and the dragons had wasted no time integrating themselves into the human resistance. Corthan was a strategist working closely with Aldric to refine battle plans, while Cirith focused on scouting and sabotage missions. Emberus, impulsive and brash, relished the front lines, where his flames wreaked havoc on enemy forces. Today, their alliance would face its first true test. A Zyrathian assault force had been spotted advancing on a critical human outpost in the desert, a supply hub that humanity could not afford to lose. "Move out," Aldric ordered, climbing aboard an armored transport. The dragons took to the skies, their silhouettes blending with the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The battle erupted with devastating intensity. The Zyrathians deployed wave after wave of soldiers and war machines, their insectoid forms swarming the battlefield. Plasma fire streaked through the air, tearing through human defenses as explosions lit up the sand. But this time, humanity fought back with firepower they had never dreamed of. Corthan descended first, unleashing a torrent of golden flames that incinerated an entire wave of Zyrathian soldiers. His roar struck terror into the invaders, their lines faltering as panic set in. "Focus fire on their armor units," Aldric shouted into his communicator, coordinating the ground forces. "Corthan, cover the east flank." Above, Cirith darted between enemy fighters, her movements a blur. She struck with precision, tearing through their formations and disabling their engines. Flaming wreckage rained down, scattering the Zyrathians further. On the ground, Emberus tore through the enemy ranks, his claws and fiery breath reducing Zyrathian war machines to molten scrap. The soldiers fighting alongside him cheered, their morale surging as the tide of battle shifted. "General, their forces are retreating," Captain Harrow reported, her voice triumphant. "Not yet," Aldric said, his eyes narrowing as he spotted movement in the distance. "They're sending in their heavy artillery." The ground trembled as the Zyrathians' biological war machines emerged. Massive, insect-like beasts with armored exoskeletons and glowing energy cannons mounted on their backs. "Dragons, focus on the beasts," Aldric commanded. "Ground forces, support them." The clash was brutal. Corthan grappled with one of the creatures, his claws tearing through its armor as it screeched in fury. Cirith circled another, dodging its attacks before striking its vulnerable joints. Emberus fought with reckless abandon, his flames engulfing one of the beasts, but its dying thrash caught him, sending him crashing to the ground. "Emberus," Aldric called, fear flickering in his voice. "I'm fine," Emberus growled, shaking off the impact and launching himself back into the fray. Together, the dragons overwhelmed the Zyrathians' final wave. As the last of the war machines fell, the battlefield fell silent, the only sound the crackling of flames and the cheers of human soldiers. Hours later, as the survivors regrouped, Aldric stood with Corthan at the edge of the battlefield. The dragon's golden eyes reflected the distant fires. "You fought well today," Corthan said, his voice low and thoughtful. "So did you," Aldric replied. "But this is just the beginning. The Zyrathians will come back, stronger and more prepared. Let them," Corthan rumbled, his chest swelling with resolve. "We are ready," Aldric nodded, determination etched into his face. Humanity had found its allies, and together, they would face whatever came next. The alliance had been forged in fire. Now it was time to prepare for war. The Zyrathian mothership loomed over Earth like a malevolent god, its jagged silhouette casting a shadow across the scarred land. From its underside, swarms of alien warships descended, filling the sky with a storm of fire and death. Below, the remnants of humanity's forces gathered, a fragile line of resistance against annihilation. General Aldric stood at the forefront of the command post, his gaze fixed on the mothership. Around him, soldiers prepared for what they knew could be their final battle. The air was heavy with tension, but Aldric's voice cut through like steel. "This is it," he said, addressing the gathered troops. "Everything we've fought for leads to today. If we fall, humanity falls. But if we stand, if we fight, then we show these invaders what it means to be human. Cheers erupted from the crowd, but Aldric didn't pause to bask in their energy. He turned to Corthan, Cirith, and Emberus, who stood nearby, their massive forms casting an aura of raw power. "We strike at the heart of the mothership," Aldric said. "You'll take the skies and clear a path for our ground forces. My team and I will infiltrate and destroy the core. If we succeed, their forces will collapse." Corthan nodded solemnly. "We will keep the invaders occupied. But beware, their leader will not go down easily." Aldric's lips tightened. "Neither will we." The battle erupted with unparalleled ferocity. The Zyrathians unleashed everything they had, their warships swarming the skies and their ground forces surging like a tide of blackened steel and chitin. Humanity's defenders responded with fire and determination, bolstered by the dragon's devastating presence. Emberus led the charge, his fiery breath cutting through the enemy ranks as ground troops followed in his wake. Cirith darted between enemy fighters, her speed and precision dismantling their aerial formations. Corthan took on the largest threats, his golden flames engulfing the Zyrathians' heavy artillery. Amid the chaos, Aldric and his team pushed toward the mothership, their armored transport weaving through the destruction. Plasma fire rained down around them, but Aldric's focus remained unshaken. Approaching the breach point, Captain Harrow called from the driver's seat. "Ready yourselves," Aldric ordered. The transport slammed into the mothership's docking bay, and Aldric's team disembarked, weapons blazing. They fought through the alien corridors, their path illuminated by the eerie glow of the mothership's pulsating walls. At the heart of the ship they found it, the core, a massive crystalline structure pulsing with energy. But standing between them and their target was the Zyrathian overlord, a towering figure of obsidian and light, its many limbs bristling with energy weapons. "You dare challenge me?" the overlord hissed, its voice echoing with malice. Aldric stepped forward, his plasma rifle raised. "I dare to end you." The battle was fierce, the overlord's attacks relentless. Aldric's team fought with everything they had, but it was Aldric who delivered the final blow, planting an explosive charge at the base of the core. "Fall back," he shouted as the timer ticked down. The mothership exploded in a blinding flash, its debris raining down like a fiery storm. On the ground, the Zyrathian forces faltered, their connection to the mothership severed. Humanity's soldiers seized the opportunity, driving the invaders back. Corthan, Cirith, and Emberus landed near the human command post, their forms battered but victorious. Aldric emerged moments later, bloodied but alive, his team behind him. "It's done," he said, his voice hoarse but triumphant. A cheer rose from the soldiers, a sound of pure, unbridled hope. As the sun rose over the battlefield, Aldric stood with Corthan, surveying the smoldering remains of the mothership. "This is not the end," Corthan said. "Others may come. Then we'll fight them too," Aldric replied, his gaze steady. Together, Corthan inclined his massive head. Together, the war wasn't over, but humanity had won its first true victory. And for the first time in years, the future seemed bright. The legend of General Aldric and his dragon guardians was only beginning.